Hey everybody, welcome back to the Art of Landscape Photography. It is now 2025 and I hope you guys are having an amazing new year so far. Between being really busy, the holidays, being pretty sick over the holidays, and having some other projects going on, I took a little bit of time off, but I'm back with a brand new video today. Well, kind of a brand new video. It's kind of a resurrection of one of my first videos that I ever made, but it's a topic that comes up pretty much my everyday life. So um, without further ado, I'm going to get right into it. Today's video is about focus stacking and focus bracketing. We're not really going to get that technical, but really the difference being that focus bracketing is kind of the act of taking the images and the stacking is the act of compiling those images. But for the sake of today's tutorial, we're just going to call it all focus stacking, and hopefully that'll all make sense for you guys. It should be pretty easy to follow. But focus stacking is one of those things that there's a lot of moving parts that sort of get overlooked. And over the years, I've seen a lot of videos about focus stacking, but nobody really talks about um, the considerations that you need to take when you're doing this, because there's a lot of things to think about. Is there wind? Is the scene really dynamic? Do I need to exposure bracket on top of focus bracketing? Um, are things blowing around in the scene? There's quite a few things to think about. Now we kind of have to start with understanding aperture. And aperture is your depth of field. It kind of controls in part how much is in focus within a single frame. Depending on where you focus in that frame and what your aperture is and what your focal length is, that is really dictating how much is in focus. And each time you move that focus point, more or less things are going to be in focus. Now, this is really, for the sake of this tutorial, we're talking about wide angle landscape photography and really pushing the limits of your wide angle lens, focusing as close as you can possibly focus to something. I really like to push the limits of the camera, and I really like to come up with these cool dynamic compositions where things really feel like they're jumping off the screen at you and really kind of in your face. And I have an example from last spring that I'll show you guys here in a little bit when we go to kind of do the focus stacking part of it. But to get back to the settings, now each situation has a particular set of circumstances that you need to consider when you're about to focus stack. Now, going back to aperture, kind of understanding that where we focus and what aperture we're at, a bigger aperture number is going to give you a greater depth of field. Therefore, more things will be in focus. A smaller number is a much bigger opening in your lens, and therefore you will have less depth of field and less things in focus. So keeping that in mind, the next thing we're going to talk about is shutter speed. If there's a small amount of wind blowing, if there's any wind blowing, you really need to pick a shutter speed that's going to freeze whatever that motion is. And a good rule of thumb that I learned years ago was that 1/80th of a second is about perfect for stopping a person running. So if you can kind of envision someone just running and how the wind is blowing and sort of correlate the two, that should give you a good starting point. Obviously, if there's nothing blowing around in the scene and there's no wind, then this number can be different. But I would always try to err on the side of using a shutter speed that's going to freeze any motion that occurs throughout taking the sequence of focus stacked images. So now we've thought about aperture and we've thought about shutter speed. The next thing we need to think about is ISO, because that is sort of the third thing in the exposure triangle. And hopefully everyone knows that the goal should always be to keep that ISO number as low as possible, because that's going to give you the best image quality. But if you're severely underexposing the image at a low ISO and you're bringing up that exposure in post-processing, you're sort of going to enhance some noise or bring out some noise that is in those darker underexposed areas. So it's a good idea to choose an ISO that might be a little bit higher than you think, because the more light you capture, the less that noise is visible. So if we have considered keeping our ISO as low as possible, and we know that maybe there's a little bit of wind blowing around, we have a shutter speed in mind that we can start with, and uh, we need to choose an aperture that's going to get as much of the scene in focus in each image as possible. Now, if there is wind and there are things blowing around, there's a good chance that those things are not going to be in the same position between each frame, even though you're using a shutter speed that is designed to stop that motion. Uh, so, what do? I always say that the best practice is to try to be patient. If you pay attention, the wind sometimes has a bit of a pattern, and you can almost um, gauge when there's going to be a slight gap in that wind. And you can usually, especially with the cameras that do this automatically, you can usually get a sequence in that gap of wind. But if you can't and things are slightly moving around, it's best to take a few sets of the same scene front to back, kind of consecutively. That way you have ample frames to choose from, if artifacts come up when we do the blending here in a little bit. So you can see here, it's a really elaborate topic and there's a lot of things going on. There's no one good set of settings for every particular case. If there was absolutely no wind, you could have your ISO down to as low as it can possibly go. You could take a really long exposure and you could use a really big aperture. All of that is going to give you the optimal, most best image quality you can possibly have. But that's not real life. And in nature, oftentimes you have environmental things that are impacting the way we shoot. So, especially when it comes to blending multiple frames like this with focus stacking, the whole point is to get everything sharp front to back. So, we want to make sure that we have the right settings for the job, even if that means that maybe we have a little bit of a noise to deal with. There are a lot of tools at our disposal nowadays in 2025 that can really help handle a lot of that noise. So we shouldn't really fear that ISO as much as maybe we did a decade or more ago, because things camera image quality is getting so much better and the tools that we use to handle that noise are getting so much better. We can look at the settings for this image and we can see that I chose 1/250th of a second because there was some wind. I chose f11 and an ISO of 640 because I had to in order to get that really fast shutter speed. Now, ordinarily, I might have chosen an aperture of something like f16 so that I didn't need as many frames. I think I needed 7 frames for this image, where if I were shooting at f16, I probably would have only needed 5. And the benefit of doing that is that there's less chance for the overlapping items in the scene to cause ghosting or artifacting because they're not in the same position between each frame. So, I wouldn't want to shoot a scene like this at f8 because you would need twice as many frames and therefore twice as many opportunities for something to go wrong in the blending. And that can be a lot of work. So I think I've babbled about that long enough and I've probably confused a lot of you. But to go back and sort of recap, I sort of like to approach these scenes with first thinking about the wind. And that sort of helps me pick a shutter speed, which then helps me pick an ISO, because I know that I'm going to be somewhere in the f11 to f16 range, just for efficiency in these scenes. Now, again, if we were shooting out in the desert somewhere and there's just nothing but rock or sand or mud and nothing's moving, of course that these settings would not apply. You would want to shoot something like ISO 100 or lower, and you wouldn't need to use such a fast shutter speed that would make you choose such a big ISO. So without further ado, let's get into the actual act of focus stacking and processing these images and putting them together. This was taken in Colorado in the high country last year on one of my workshops. And I on this one, I kind of worked backwards. In certain situations when you have some really dynamic light happening, or in this case had some cloud inversion and some fog, sometimes I'll focus on that event or whatever is happening in the scene, and I'll try to just capture some frames of that, because the light that's happening in front of me, it might be stable and not too much is changing. And that's sort of what happened in this case. I was trying to wait for the most dramatic and moody clouds and fog that I could get. And then as soon as I captured that, I would then go back and shoot the focus stack. So this one is actually shot backwards, where the mountains are in focus first and the foreground is in focus last. Now, for those of you that have the automatic focus shifting feature in your camera, you will almost, I think, universally need to focus on your foreground first, because this will only work in one direction, and then you need to refocus your lens on whatever that foreground item is and then restart the process. So you will likely never run into this situation where you're kind of in reverse, but it makes no difference for us in terms of processing and stacking the images. It's really just how they're captured. Um, so this scene, if we go over here to develop, we look at the histogram, and if we go down here, I've already done a couple of things just to kind of rein in the dynamic range here. I've brought the highlights down and the exposure down a little bit because those clouds were really, really bright. If I just hit my backslash key, you can see how really bright and intense those clouds were. And so I just brought them down a little bit to make sure everything was within the histogram. I was lucky that I did not need to exposure bracket in this case, because that adds sort of another level of complexity to the process. But let's say we did have some overexposed highlights, and at the very end of the focus stack, I had a darker exposure. I would simply go ahead and stack all of the frames that have a consistent exposure and settings, blend them all together, and then bring in the darker exposure, align it, and use your blending method of choice to recover those highlights. I'm lucky in this case. If we look at the histogram, I did not need to do that. I was able to capture everything in one frame, air quotations, so to speak, since we are focus stacking. But yeah, I'm going to go ahead and just make sure that chromatic aberration is removed. We have a dynamic scene here, some really, really brightly lit mountains, and it's in those areas where the chromatic aberration can be the worst. We have an ISO of 640. We could use the AI noise reduction and really, really clean these up, but ISO 640 is really not that big of a deal. I think if we simply mask some of this away, remembering that white reveals and black conceals, then we are actually masking some of that sharpness out of the areas that have less texture and detail. So that's going to clean up our image a lot just by masking some of that out. I'm not going to worry about the noise reduction. And for the sake of this tutorial, I'm not really going to worry about much of the post-processing, other than just kind of reining in the dynamic range so that we can get into the actual stacking of the images. So I'm going to make sure that all of these images are highlighted and that I've synced whatever settings I have applied. And we're going to right click and we're going to open all of these as layers in Photoshop. Okay, now that we're over here in Photoshop, for the sake of this tutorial and for the fact that most of you will probably be working front to back, I'm going to go ahead and reverse these images so that I can see it in that format. So I'm just going to go to Layer, Arrange, and we're just going to reverse that order. And so now on the top of the layer stack, I have my foreground, and then the focus points move further back as I go down the image stack. Now, you can see as I move through these files that there is a slight amount of movement. And so I'm going to show you guys how we address that to the best of our abilities. And we're just going to use Photoshop to do the focus stacking. Now, there are other focus stacking softwares out there. I have a lifetime subscription to he'll look on focus, but I find that Photoshop currently does just as good of a job for these sort of wide field landscape images that are only requiring a handful of frames. So I'm just going to do this in Photoshop. Save your money, I feel like, on buying a focus stacking software specifically for landscape. I think Photoshop is only going to get better at it, and it does a great job so far. So we're just going to use Photoshop. So now that we've got all of our images in a layer stack here, I'm going to select them all. I'm going to go to Edit, Auto Align Layers. We're going to click Auto. That's going to take a few seconds to do. All right, now that they are aligned, you will almost always have a border around the image. This is where certain frames have been shrunken down and distorted to make sure that everything aligns, because what you don't realize when you're shifting focus is that optically things are distorting each time the lenses move away and closer to each other. So there's always going to be this border, and when we actually get them focus stacked, this border will go from this transparent pixel background to a kind of blurry edge all around the image. So as a note, I always suggest shooting a little bit wider than you intend the final image to be cropped to, because you're always going to have a little bit of a border around the image from where the focus breathing occurred. So now that we have those images aligned, we're going to go ahead and hit Command or Control G with them all selected so that it puts them into a group. Then we're going to hit Command or Control J to duplicate that group, and I'm going to turn that top group off. This is our recovery group. This is going to have all of the layers that we will need to recover any of the parts of the image that get potentially artifacty from the blending. Say the flowers aren't in the same position between each frame, we can use this this upper group to recover those artifacts. So I'm going to expand that lower group and reselect all those frames. And we're going to go to Edit and Auto Blend Layers this time. Going to make sure that we're choosing Stack Images. And I like to make sure seamless tones and colors and content aware fill transparent areas. This is where the blurry edge is going to come from. That's going to kind of eliminate or hide the transparent pixel background. So I like to just click that, because even if there is a little bit of blur around the edges, if you crop it off and you miss a little bit, you just don't see it. So I like to just make sure that that's clicked, and we're going to hit OK. And this is going to take a few more minutes. All right, so when it finishes its focus stacking, you will end up with this merged layer at the top of that layer stack within that first group. What I like to do is pull that outside of the group so that it's in between these two groups, and then I just sort of collapse this, because we really won't do anything with those layers, even if there is an error in the blend. So now I like to zoom in and really look for any issues that could have occurred where there's some blurring or some artifacting happening. But like I said, Photoshop is getting really, really good at focus stacking images. Now you can kind of see here down at the bottom, there's this blurry band that is from the focus breathing. But let's see if we have a layer in our group here above that can help us recover that. So I'm just going to click through these until I find the layer where that lower edge of the frame is nice and in focus. And it actually looks like it's this one right here. So I'm going to turn the other layers in that group off. We're going to put a black mask on it by hitting the mask button and then hit Command or Control I. And now we're going to use a brush at 100% opacity here. And we're just going to blend that back in, just to make sure that that bottom edge is nice and sharp. All right. You can see here there's a little bit of blurring on these leaves. I don't believe they're going to be in focus in this frame. Actually, that helped clean that up just wonderfully. You can kind of see there's a little bit of a double edge here from where those leaves were not in the same position between each frame. I think the leaves are less noticeable than the flowers, so really take your time. One thing I always make sure to quadruple check are horizon lines. And almost without fail, especially in scenes like this, you'll notice where the edges get kind of hazy and blurry. Let's look up here. I'm going to go ahead and activate that background layer just so I can see if anything pops out. And you can actually see there's an area right up here on this ridge on the right where there's just some out of focus bits where the blend didn't go perfectly. So just like we did with the previous layer, we're going to activate that layer. We're going to put a black mask on it. I'm going to grab my brush tool. And since this frame actually is responsible for the focus for most of the image, you can see pretty much everything beyond our foreground flowers here to the background is in focus. I can sort of blanket this layer in. I don't have to be too careful as long as I avoid our foreground. Everything beyond that point to infinity should be nice and in focus. Yeah, that looks great. Now we've revealed a little bit of this top band. I'm going to go ahead and just switch back to a black brush and just mask that out. So that is how we recover some of the artifacting and the anomalies that can occur. Once we've done that, I'll zoom in here so you can kind of see the blurred border that we have all around the image. We're going to go ahead and we're going to crop this down just to make sure that we don't have any of that blur in the final product. So we're just going to go ahead and crop that in, and we're going to eliminate that blurred edge all around. Now we're ready to go back into Camera Raw or use Photoshop adjustments to continue post-processing this image. But that is how I like to focus stack in Photoshop and recover artifacts when they come up. I hope you guys really enjoyed that video and you were able to follow along and glean some tips and tricks out of it. I hope that you'll try focus stacking if you haven't already. It is one of my favorite things to do, and it's been sort of the bread and butter in my photography. I love being able to maximize these otherwise small little scenes and really make them feel huge and substantial and dramatic and dynamic, and that they're jumping off the screen at you and really create this three-dimensional type of image. So thank you guys for watching, and I hope I'll see you on the next one.